Welcome once again to our series Back from the Future. This is our final session, part 4 of Postmodernism, and we're going to take some time to review some of the precepts of postmodernism, which we've been doing all along. The first precept that we came across was from Francois Lyotard, disbelief in big stories. These are the large overarching narratives or stories that explain the world to us. And these are characteristic of the modernist world that we've inherited, that we've been living in through the 20th century. And those stories are no longer considered valid. Those are suspect as to whether they truly explain what is necessary for us to grasp a hold of in terms of truth. The second precept then is all is interpretation by Jacques Derrida, and this is coming from his coining of the phrases death of the author, death of the text, in which the original authors like Camus, Shakespeare, so forth, all Tolstoy, all the great writers of our literature, history of literature, are there just as unknown meanings. They have meaning to the author who wrote, but for us living distant from their times, we can't really be sure that we have their interpretation, their understanding or meaning, and therefore all is interpretation. So even folks that write about them are doing the business of interpreting. So your interpretation is just as good as somebody else's, and therefore the only thing that's meaningful that you can count on is the way that you feel about it, the way that you come to understand it, but trying to discern that from what the author originally wrote is considered a futile process. So the idea is deconstruction, and in this area, so many parts of our society are reacting in this way to the postmodern idea of tearing down, to destroy and sweep away the traditional values that we've been holding for so many decades and even centuries. These are to be swept away because they are they're subject to so much interpretation and so much you might say bias, and aren't really good indications of what the reality might be. And some of them obviously are beyond the ability to understand what the author meant. So best thing to do is to deconstruct them and then rebuild their meaning using our own understanding of what the meaning might be. So we have a video here, just a short video clip. It's surprising that President Obama former President Obama has been speaking on various tours and is using some of the terminology of postmodernism, the idea that our own values, the things that are precious to us in society are being torn down, are being challenged, are being undermined. This is all postmodern terminology, and it's interesting that our past president is actually using that terminology. Take a listen.
Strongman politics are ascendant suddenly, whereby elections and some pretense of democracy are maintained, the form of it, but those in power seek to undermine every institution or norm that gives democracy meaning.
So in this particular context, the president is looking at what political parties are doing, and it's quite interesting that when he was formulating the health care bill, that many of the Republican and conservative scholars and politicians were saying that that's exactly what the president's administration was doing, is to create a dilemma in which society needs to really sweep into the realm and the world of government-sponsored health care, single payer, which is a step towards the socialist model. And that requires that we undo the standards and traditions of our past, which would include the way we've done healthcare in the past, the way we've looked at society and government. So it's kind of ironic that he's saying this, but nonetheless, this feature is prominent in many aspects of government, and you can find politicians, representatives in the House of Representatives and senators who sign up for this kind of thing. Much needs to be swept away so that a new world, a new America can be built again. Very postmodern. So is our government then following postmodernism? And that would be a question that most people would draw a question mark about. This is really how a philosophy takes hold in the general sense of the word. It's in bits and pieces. It's not wholesale. The writers and thinkers we've talked about in this series, Francois Lyotard, Derrida, also Foucault, those kinds of people are, we don't see politicians reading their works and saying, I'm going to sign up for all of postmodernism, nor do we see society doing the same thing. They are taking pieces of it and incorporating some pieces, and in many cases, the places where much more of it is being disseminated is in our schools. And that's why we've emphasized not only high school experience, but college and university life, because that's where most of the insidious part of postmodernism is being portrayed. It's being vended, you might say, to students who are ripe for this kind of molding. So last time we talked about the left-leaning nature of universities, and we mentioned that universities are getting increasingly hostile in their atmosphere. Free speech is being curtailed in selective ways, and there's this new vocabulary of fear. And so we talked about the identity politics, white privilege, hate speech, microaggressions, safe spaces, trigger warnings. And in case you were thinking that this sort of thing is just on the campuses, just in student affairs and relationships, here's a case where you're right in Congress, in the committee meetings that are going on in the Congress. Here's Jim Jordan, a representative from Ohio, on a House committee using these very terms.
You start with the safe spaces, safe zone, trigger warnings, microaggressions, bias response teams, and even riots, as we saw in the first video. And where does it end? It ends with students holding hostage a president of the university, and he has to ask permission to go to the men's room.
So it's quite interesting that someone like Jim Jordan is mouthing, you might say, this trend that we talked about in schools. He's very much aware. In other words, this sort of thing that we talked about last week or last session is getting into the halls of Congress. People are talking about it because it is likely to be legislated in cities and towns and places where people thought they had public life. And these things are infringing on free speech. And so Congress is now getting into the mix of concerns about it, and we'll have to see where that goes. But society is beginning to change because of these ideas. So we come then to our new precept, which is from Michel Foucault, and we talked about him before. And he's, again, one of the French writers and thinkers. And he coined this statement, the truth is an exercise of power. And I believe we may have talked about this before. It's not capital T truth. He's not thinking of truth from the standpoint of the modernist, which says that there are absolute truths. There are truths that overarch and explain the entire world. He's thinking in terms of small t truth, because as we in Judeo-Christian thinking look at the word truth, we think of it as something that's absolute, but it isn't an exercise of power. It's simply a fact of nature, a fact of God's kingdom, but it isn't trying to control people. It's simply a case of you either assent to the truth or you deny the truth, and then there are consequences for those decisions. But the truth is not out there marching along trying to enslave people. Whereas in Foucault's idea, the little truths that we all have, from the concept that Lyotard mentioned, there are no big stories, so there are lots of little stories. Those truths he sees as exercises of power, and so he's seeing this in a negative light. So let's take a look at where these are cropping up. Truth is socially constructed in Foucault's idea. That means that society gets together and declares various elements of truth, and they come from various sectors of society, but they're socially constructed. An example would be in the coming out announcement that is made by transgender or gay, lesbian people. Years ago, anyone who did that was shunned, and so obviously it wasn't done very often. And so today, now it's a heroic thing. On a television show, a talk show, someone says that they're coming out, then they're cheered. It's a big heroic event. And that's society basically saying we're going to change the attitude about this particular moral idea, this behavior. And so from Foucault's point of view, society is really controlling how the truth is understood. Another concept here is that groups seek to suppress each other using their own truths. So Group A seeks to suppress Group B. It can be a minority or a majority of people on either side, but they're using their version of truth to suppress the other group. So an example of this would be the transgender minority in this country, using their version of truth as to whether the lesbian gay phenomenon or the idea of fluid gender is now a truth that's undeniable, and the rest of the world has to catch up, and they will use legislation in order to enforce that. That's an exercise of power, and it's coming about in various ways. One of them is the use of these pronouns that we've talked about. And here's a list of some of just a short list of some of the pronouns that are being mandated. These are pronouns that it's going to be very difficult for non-trans people to incorporate. And so that's kind of a forced area of speech. And so some critics of this are resisting it because it's really a restriction of free speech. It's not the same as saying, well, you have to restrict your speech to not use the N-word. That's quite different because we don't use the N-word in almost every sentence. And it's easy for us to remember that that word is verboten and that we need to use a more politically correct term to describe the African American member of our society. Whereas in these cases, we're actually compelling a particular kind of speech. We're not restricting speech in certain cases because it's offensive. We're compelling people to use certain words and avoid other words. That's an infringement of free speech because when you try to incorporate these pronouns, and there are some 80 supposed combinations of these, trying to keep track of where your pronouns are in a sentence as you speak is going to slow down people's speech, going to interfere with their thought process, and that's a real invasion of privacy and speech rights in this country. So more exercises of power are available in recent times. Some recent events have happened. The Battle of Portland, which was in July of the 1st of July in 2018, between two groups, Antifa and Patriot Prayer. Patriot Prayer is a group that has come about more recently as a reaction to all of the anti-white supremacy, anti-white privilege, all of those kinds of riots, the Black Lives Matter folks and all that sort of thing. So it's a reaction in which Christian men, many of them quite beefy and quite hefty, have come to disrupt to portray their confidence and their endorsement of the American way of life, the way of life that we've been living up until now. And that many of these offenses that the other groups see are fictitious. They are made up. They are falsely presented. They're lacking the power of factual evidence. And so they're standing up for the things that America has stood for all along. So that's called the Patriot Prayer Group. They're joined by another group called the Proud Boys. And these, again, are people who come to help defend the American way of life and the American values. Antifa is a group that's anti-fascist. And so they're saying, of course, they come to these meetings that are duly established by permits in cities and so forth, and try to disrupt them and try to silence them. So what you're about to see is a video in which, in Portland, the Patriot Prayer Group was assembled to speak their piece, to share their truths, and the Antifa group had shown up with weapons. crudely made weapons, and strangely enough, they were not trapped at the entry points where this stuff was checked. So there's a battle going on actually in the streets here of Portland, and this is a sign that in some people's minds is a forerunner to perhaps a lot of civil war that could actually break out in this country. So we'll take a look at it and then we'll talk about it on the other side. So you can see in this case here that the violence on both sides is felt to be justified. The Patriot Prayer Group, who is a right-wing free speech for all type group, comes with the intention of using some muscle, and they're usually more heavily muscled, you might say, than the other groups are. But they don't mess around. In other words, there is a violence, there is physical altercations, and you can see the young lady got clocked there in the last part of that video. That's a violence that Jesus never supported, but nonetheless, this group is representing Christian values and Judeo-Christian values, and is essentially saying we've had enough of this sort of thing. You'll have to judge whether or not this is an appropriate way to demonstrate. The Antifa folks, or here's an example of some of the Patriot Prayer folks. The Antifa folks are left-wing, so their interest is to end white domination, and they bring implemented weapons, and here is an example of some of those. There's a nice, nasty nail at the end of that board there, and supposedly within this pole that has a flag on it, there's a blade that comes out later in the actual rioting. So this is the kind of situation that we're facing in our country, and many people look at this and say we're very close to civil war. You can imagine what would happen if guns were disseminated in this population, what the results might have been. So the Patriot Prayer Group says we have a right to our truth, and it's free speech, and we're not happy with the idea that you're denying us free speech but giving free speech to the victimized classes. Antifa is saying we reject your truth. It's white speech equals hate. So those are the standing points, and you can understand that there's a tremendous amount of ill patience, not waiting for discernment or listening to the other side. It's simply a matter of using force to get one's way. So there's sort of an inconsistency in what Foucault has presented compared to the earlier postmodernists. So Lyotard has this notion that there are no big stories, there are therefore no big truths, and there are, of course, lots of mini truths, lots of little truths. And we showed a few of these at the very beginning of our session here: gay, lesbian story, the feminist story, and so on. These are the small truths that Lyotard says exist as a result of there being no big truths. And according to him, these are okay. In other words, he doesn't go on to say, and even these must go. So Foucault comes along and says truths are exercises of power, and so he's really attacking the little truths that Lyotard is somewhat more forgiving about. And this is where there's an inconsistency between these two writers. So Foucault's idea is you abandon all hope of any truth. And the irony is that with Foucault, we see people rioting, we see students protesting, we see social justice attacks, and so on. And those are all claiming elements of truth, that their truth is important and therefore should be listened to. So they're not really following Foucault, and Foucault is having to realize that these stories exist and they aren't going to go away. So as a result of this, you might ask the question, is it really feasible that a person under Foucault's influence can abandon all hope of truth? Their exercises of power that endure, and in essence we can say in criticism that Foucault has basically forgotten about human nature, that human nature is this way and it's going to exercise its will. So American institutions were selective about postmodern ideas, meaning that not everything was incorporated from postmodernism, and so that's why you see it in piecemeal today. But it is having some devastating effects in some areas. The pieces that are being accepted, that people can relate to and like, are of great concern, even if they're not buying into the whole corpus of postmodern theory. So they're pieces at a time, and the ones that are most liked are the idea that there are no big stories, there are no absolutes, there are no overarching moral themes. You control the meaning, and that truth is an exercise of power. That is a concept that in some cases, as we just illustrated, people themselves are not signing up for, but other institutions actually are, and we're going to see that in just a moment. So truth as an exercise of power we're going to focus on, and the area has to do with our own U.S. Supreme Court. Surprisingly, a place where we think that truth and justice reign supreme. But you'd be surprised how that's changing. So here's the recently, well actually not too recently, back in 2009, Sonia Sotomayor was eventually selected as a justice of the Supreme Court. She's here at a speech at Berkeley in May of 2009, and she has an interesting statement that she makes. I would say that a wise Latina woman with the richness of her experiences would more often than not reach a better conclusion than a white male who hasn't lived that life. So she feels that the richness of a Latino woman's experiences are actually better than what a white man who hasn't experienced those things would be able to discern. So there are different types of wise, there are different kinds of wise depending on one's experience. A strange thing for a justice of the Supreme Court to be saying. The Latina woman's experience is actually more informative. But conclusions ought to be about the law and morality, not someone's experience. Here's an example. She had this particular problem in her confirmation hearing, and senators who were evaluating her confirmation were asking her to account for this kind of statement because it was completely off the wall, completely strange to the normal expectations of how justice is dispensed. So in matters of logic, things don't change with experience. All bachelors or unmarried males is a logical statement, and it doesn't change. It can't be different from person to person or from experience to. So Justice Sonia Sotomayor goes on to say feminist theories of judging are in creation and are not and may never aspire to be solidified as the established legal doctrines appear to be. In other words, heretofore we've had a solidification of established legal doctrines that have been the lay of the land, the way of operation. But she's saying that feminist theories are in creation and they may not ever aspire to be solidified in the same way that the other precepts have been. So she's saying that there is a difference between judging in general and how a feminist should judge. The feminist idea of judging is always under construction, never arriving at a finished or definite place. That's a strange statement to make because, of course, she's a feminist. So she says, I accept that to judge is an exercise of power. There can never be a universal definition of wise. So we want to pay attention to what has just been said here. I accept that to judge is an exercise of power. We might ask the question, who said this first? Well, it was Foucault. So whether she's a postmodernist in the sense that she's studied it, she's familiar with the literature, and she studied Foucault, she's bought into his precept. And it's now sitting on the benches of the Supreme Court this very moment as she uses her her background, and her commitment to these ideas to judge cases. There can never be a universal definition of wise. That's a very strange thing for a justice to say. So we have another example in which she was speaking in the DC area, and a guest, she was as a guest, and the congressional staffer to Governor Mike Pence at the time was in attendance in the audience, and he'd always wanted to ask this question of a Supreme Court justice. So he waited till all the other questions had finished and then stood up and asked this particular question. What should be the foundation of justice for our country? What should be the foundation of justice for our country? Now, is that a mean question? I mean, we just have to ask whether that's a trick question. Was the guy being insensitive? Is it an unfair question for someone like a justice of the Supreme Court? I think logic would tell us that it's a perfectly legitimate question because that is their business. The reaction was that Sotomayor stood in dead silence for an awkward long time and couldn't really grapple with the question. And when she finally did muster a response, she said, "I don't think I've ever considered the question in that form before." Well, that's not the kind of response that a justice should have. If you're on the bench and you're dealing out and ensuring that justice is performed, and you don't know, you don't understand the form of a question that would say, what's the foundation by which you're judging and how justice should be applied to this country? Should you really be there? It's a very profound statement and one that is haunting and disturbing to folks who value these kinds of things. And of course, her response is in complete consistency with her own beliefs. There is no foundation because from her standpoint as a feminist, it's always under construction. So the point would be, why care? Well, if you're a baker, and you've seen this recently in the news, and you're confronted with the gay and lesbian world, and they come to ask you to bake a cake, and you feel that it's not so much a case of letting them celebrate themselves and you be out of the picture, you're now participating in their celebration. If you happen to feel that strongly, then you're going to be wanting some aid from the law to help you. If you're a clerk in a wedding license bureau, and two gay men come in and demand license from you, and it's against your faith and religion to participate or to enable them, you don't have any problem if they want to get married by somebody else's will or assistance, but you as a Christian feel that you don't want to aid and abet them and enable them, and you stand your ground, you're now in trouble with the law, and this goes to a Supreme Court case. But if the court is under the impression that there's no universal definition of wise or just, how confident are you going to be? So when we say, why should I care, there's a case that you ought to be concerned with. So here are the precepts then: disbelief in big stories, there's nothing but interpretation, no legitimate norms, we talked about that last time, and traditional institutions are broken. Remember, we talked about the television shows of The Cosby Show and Seinfeld, and the institutions of home, state, and church, and schools, so forth, those institutions being broken. So now we come to a new precept. Right and wrong is whatever your contemporaries let you get away with. Right and wrong is whatever your contemporaries let you get away with. Sounds like a very liberal idea that's been around for a while, but the writer of this particular idea, who's actually put it into a more formal form of statement, is Richard Rorty, who's not part of the French school of postmodernists. He's an American, and he has written extensively on this subject, but he's the author of this particular statement, and he has his reasons, obviously. He says there's no finality to right and wrong, only an unending conversation. That's a very liberal, ethereal type statement. Instead of the definite right and wrong, if you're right, you're not wrong. If you're wrong, you're not right. Those kinds of things. It's either A or B. But to have someone come along and say that really morality is just an unending conversation, very unsettling, a very liberal idea. And in postmodernism, this is the way things go, is to take away the strength of firm positions and make them kind of schmooze into this undeterminate, indefinite space. So an example would be parental discipline. A child has a more of a stern, strict set of parents. He gets disciplined for doing something that other kids get away with, and then the kid goes to school and his friends gather around and they have this discussion about how harsh the parents are compared to other parents. And so what happens is right and wrong get evaluated in terms of what contemporaries let you get away with. So if kids were king, they would have a different take on this. And eventually even parents have a tendency to cave in to what all the parents in the neighborhood think, especially if they're in places where the neighborhood is the way of life. And I've seen parents get hoodwinked, you might say, and pressured into caving in to the will of the community simply because their desire to remain a valid member of that society is important, and taking a stand has been a very hard thing for them to do. So this discussion then comes to determine what is really going to be right and wrong. So if time and society can change the discussion about right and wrong, that nothing has finality, according to Rorty. So again, whatever your contemporaries let you get away with is what is right and wrong. So the other area of postmodernism that the writers have not written on, but we see fanning out in terms of behavior in our society, is how the effects of postmodernism do their effect on the soul. In other words, what's the effect on the soul? And one of those is there's no fixed identity, because the traditional, what they call cisgender identities of male and female, he and she, are considered to be part of the old world, the idea of fixed identities, and that's being done away. So very, very postmodern idea that we deconstruct that notion and we build up a new notion that identities are fluid and can be can gravitate between different types and styles of identities. It doesn't have to be binary. In other words, he or she. It can be multiple. This is very confusing for most of us from the Judeo-Christian background. So if I reject my given identity, then who am I? In other words, people are saying, I don't like who I am. I don't like being the son of my parents or the identity that my parents have given me. Therefore, who am I? And the next reaction, of course, is we say we don't have a clue who we really are. So people then begin to reinvent themselves. So in the popular world, the entertainment world, this is playing out in a milder way. You ask the question, who is Madonna? And the answer might be, or the question coming back might be, well, which decade are we talking about? Because her identity has changed through the decades. There's this view of Madonna. There's this view. There's this one. And there's this one. Now, a person could say, but these are all part of her entertainment brand, the style that she likes to portray on stage. But it's also argued that many people in entertainment are expressing an aspect of themselves. They will even admit that they are pouring themselves and their souls into their performances, and they're actually conveying that this is the person they want you to see in the course of entertainment. So even though they may be doing this on stage, there's a certain amount of reveal that they're giving the audiences as to who they are, and that's changing. Another person is Britney Spears. This is a picture of her when she first became popular, and then she changed to this view. She had other changes in between, but she had that particular view. And this is again her saying, I'm not comfortable with who I am. I want to experiment with my identity. And this was quite a radical change for her, because everything in her life was wrapped up around the beauty of her person and her looks. And this was quite bizarre, but she was essentially saying, I want to control how you see me. So another one, of course, that's famous for this is Lady Gaga. Here's a fairly normal picture, somewhat bizarre here. This is what's called camp, in which you dress up in these very bizarre outfits and hairstyles and so on. Here's another one that's quite bizarre. This one is sort of the Bride of Frankenstein look. But nonetheless, she finds it necessary. She finds it needful to present herself this way. This one's quite bizarre. And this one was not necessarily on stage. This is her simply at a party where she chose to go out in public without necessarily being on stage and performing and look this way to the public. So someone might say, well, Mike, this is the sort of thing that you expect from performers. That's all she's doing. When she's home washing the dishes, she's not going to be looking like that. This is Victoria Beckham, and she looks pretty much the same regardless of what her performance style is or what her public image might be or her photographic modeling career might be. She looks pretty much the same. And in daily life, she doesn't look much different. Whereas in the case of Lady Gaga, we see quite a bit of non-professional, non-stage acting out in which in public she dresses up. And you might say, well, this is just a gag for her. It's just a shtick that she does. But she's in essence saying, this is the person I want you to see from moment to moment, and it changes. So for Lady Gaga, it's a matter of what day is it, as to who is Lady Gaga, right? So here again, some of the pictures that she has in various places, all varieties of things that she enjoys dressing up in to convey this idea that she really doesn't know who she is, and it's her brand. So in another case here, you see people who are famous are not necessarily obligated to present their brand in ordinary circumstances. They're perfectly fine. So it's not a case of celebrity that causes this. It's a case of a loss of identity or not knowing who oneself is. So it's an identity that is identity then separate, or does brand drive identity? Is a good question. So another popular figure is Eminem. And he hasn't changed his persona, his look very much, but he has made some outstanding statements. He's said in many of his concerts, I am what you say I am. So in terms of his identity, he's perfectly willing to let you determine for him who he is. This is all a case, of course, of cases of people who simply don't know who they are and need to have some control over finding that identity. This also brings up the issue of tattooing. It's somewhat related because in tattooing, a person is saying, I'm going to create a piece of art and I'm going to use my body as the canvas. And in doing so, I'm going to be sharing something about myself. Now, years ago, decades ago, tattooing was always a sign of the counterculture, the criminal world, people in prisons and so forth. And it was meant to be scary and to let you know that they are not part of the mainstream of society and they have no intention of being so, that they're going to destroy society if they get the chance. And that was always the association of tattoos. Today, this young lady is not doing that to rebel against society. She's doing it to express the meaning of who she is. Here's some other ones. This is a little on the dark side. But there are others that can be much more creatively done. This fellow feels that his entire back is the canvas that he'd like to create. Now, surprisingly, he doesn't see it. So you know that what he's doing this for is to let you see it. It's less important that he see it. He wants you to interpret and understand who he is by the means of this art. This one's a strange one. You have to wonder why her parents ever let her go out of the house this way. Maybe she's emancipated, I'm not sure. Also, most of these tattoos have the characteristic greenish and bluish type tint, so this may be not necessarily permanent. It'd be interesting to find out. But of course, the whole purpose of this is to be bizarre, is to state, I'm going to shock you, and that's part of who I am. So in addition to that, we have the phenomenon today of body piercing. That's not too prevalent here in the locale that we're living in, but in some parts of the U.S., certainly in the East Coast and West Coast, body piercing is becoming quite popular and is quite bizarre. This is a young lady who is quite attractive, so there isn't a problem that she's upset about her appearance, yet she feels the necessity to strap on this hardware to let you know who she is. Here's a person who goes to the extent of actually putting ball bearings under the skin and other appliances over his eyes. And there's also a hole in his chin. There's a plug there that can be taken out, and you can actually see his gum and teeth and so on. And this is permanent, but this is the extent to which kids will go to say, this is who I am. This gentleman here has obviously some self-image issues and feels that this is the only way that he can really express himself and gain the attention he would never get without it. But it's quite extreme. This is a young lady who's become quite famous, and I believe she's Hispanic. And this is the picture of her in normal life when she was younger. Nice looking lady, but she felt the need to change her appearance and change her identity to this. Now this particular picture is done for ads and for photography, for modeling and so on, so that's part of her career. But you'll have to understand that some of this stuff is permanent. So here's another picture that's quite severe. But in real life, she's pretty close to this sort of thing. If you take off the hardware, and sometimes she doesn't, she pretty much lives this style for the rest of her life, and that's the sad part of this, is when she gets to be in her 60s, she's going to be wondering what she's done with herself. But the idea behind this is all necessary, very satisfying, because she's declaring for you in forceful ways, this is the person I want you to see. So it's a huge self-image issue that pervades most of these changes. I need to control my image. I need an image I can control. Frightening is okay because you're forced then to notice the me that I've created. And the thing that's striking about this is not, as some have thought, simply a dissatisfaction with one's own appearance. This young lady is quite attractive, doesn't need the hardware. But for her, it's necessary to declare her identity. So what do you do with postmodernism then as a Christian? That's a good question, and this is wrapping up our sessions in this vein. How do you characterize the postmodernists? Well, the best single word that we can think of is the word lost. A lot of other words might come to mind, but the one that might be spiritually oriented is the word lost. These are people who have lost their way. And we're reminded of the scripture here in Proverbs, there's a way that seemeth right unto man, but the end thereof is the way of death. And that's the unfortunate plight of many folks who have not been exposed to biblical truths, have not been exposed to Judeo-Christian values. They seek a path that seems to be right, and there are plenty of other folks going down that path, but the end is destruction. So here are the writers and the theorists, and for all of them, they have been stuck, you might say, in a mind unguided by the Spirit. This is the result of people who refuse to submit to or expose themselves to the Judeo-Christian ideal, to the idea that God has made them as creatures for His pleasure. And as a result, these are the pathways that the mind can travel, unguided by the Spirit. So it's possible to adopt a complete set of beliefs about the truth that moves a person further and further beyond reach. And this is then the definition of lost. They're skeptical about reality, skeptical about what's true. Morality is a social construct. Those are very disturbing, lost concepts. And that places them really beyond reach, you would think. So here are the classic questions that kids get asked to write a thesis on in their early days of college. How did I get here? Why am I here? Where am I going? And then the postmodernist has this kind of statement: I don't care how I got here. I can't know why I'm here. I don't know who I am. That's really a good definition of lost. And that's the way that we ought to evaluate this, because this whole worldview is coming upon us whether we like it or not. And you have to understand its character and how to avoid it and why it's wrong. So in this vein, how does a Christian then witness within a postmodern world, or to people who are, you might say, enamored with postmodern ideas? We're tempted to think like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. Toto, I don't think we're in Kansas anymore. The world around us is really changing to the point that it's almost unrecognizable. So for the Christian in the postmodern world, we need to make a clear statement that postmodernism is an evil. It's an evil invention implanted in minds that have lost their way. Postmodernism is an evil invention implanted in the minds of those that have lost their way. That's an important statement that you have to affirm. They became lost after abandoning a life populated by truths. Somehow they were beguiled, we would believe, by Satan to discount the idea that truth is even knowable. Young people who embrace postmodernism then, for the first time, are really starting out lost. Lots of young people are coming into the world and their parents haven't done any kind of moralistic training or Judeo-religious training, and the first thing they hit is postmodernism. Not as that title, but all the precepts. They're going to get those in schools and in universities, and that means they're going to be starting out lost already. So that's a danger. Don't repeat their mistakes. That's our advice to anyone listening. So postmodernists have been around for about 30 years. Judeo-Christian ideals have been around for some 4,000 years. Quite a difference in terms of durability. Yet it's surprising how people will trash the 4,000-year legacy and opt for a 30-year running period. Making a mistake about something this important has huge consequences. So to be lost in matters of common sense is really a travesty. Take a case here of poverty in America, just to give you an idea about how to just think about common sense. There are 3 things to avoid permanent poverty in the United States, in America. This is a study done by the Brookings Institute. And these 3 things are the things that you can do. If you do these things, you'll avoid permanent poverty. Graduate from high school, get a job, don't have babies until you're married. And Judge Judy would say don't have babies until you can afford them. The people who are poor, and even permanently so, have violated one or more of these principles. They've not graduated from high school, they've not gotten a job, or they've had babies when they couldn't afford it or weren't married. And the vast majority of women who are in poverty are single mothers. So the statistics about this, or the stats, you might say, that go with this research are from the Brookings Institute, is that 2% of the people who followed these guidelines remained in poverty. 75% of the people who followed these guidelines left poverty and joined the middle class. That's a huge, you might say, endorsement of these principles, and it's surprising how many people will not follow these guidelines. So that's just a matter of using common sense with a very practical aspect of our society in terms of how to avoid a simple thing like poverty. So what the Christian ought to be is another area of common sense. There are lots of things in the Bible that help us to formulate how we're going to live. You're a heavenly citizen of God's kingdom. Realizing that's true, that you're a citizen of God's kingdom, is a logical thing to affirm. It makes common sense. You must be born again is a statement that's made by Jesus in the 3rd chapter of John. You've got to be transformed. Living and thinking like Jesus, that's part of the Christian message. That's part of the Christian life. It's not a philosophy, but a way of life. Then what's our place in the body of Christ? What's our place in the whole assembly of Christians at large in the world? They're viewed as the body of Christ, therefore we have a function. And what's our place in that body? Knowing our talents, gifts, and spiritual gifts. These are given to us by a loving God. Knowing what they are and exploring what they are is important to knowing who we are and where we stand. What is God's will for me? Many people draw a blank on this because God hasn't spoken to them. But in many ways, the things that they are excited about that are also in accordance with the kingdom of God are the very things that God is willing for us. And of course, if there's a doubt, just look at the things that Jesus did, the things that Jesus was interested in. Those would certainly be the will for us. How we ought to worship, that should be something that we ask a question about, and that determines also where we might worship in terms of a church. But what does worship mean and how should we do it? Answering that question is a common sense question about our Christian life. What is God's will or ministry for the world and for us in a much larger scope? Are we called to the mission field? Are we called to some kind of a ministry? That may not be true. It may be a case in which God has for you a place in the secular world to be a witness. And what is the Christian's response to social diversity? The gay and lesbian issue, all of the minorities. How do we deal with folks, especially folks who do not want to change and want us to accept them as they are? And the Christian in relationship to democracy. How do we stand when the government or our country begins to be the enemy of our faith? These are important questions that I think we need to embrace. But as you look at those questions, they help you to stand. And in the case of the postmodernist, you're not going to fight against postmodernism as a resource, as a debate. There are folks who are more gifted at doing that. You may be called to be that kind of a person. But as we talked about last week, you're going to have the experience of talking to someone individually, one-on-one. And if you do what we just talked about, you answer those questions, you're going to know where you stand and how you can reach someone else. Because in the end, at the bottom of all things, even postmodernists have a desire to see that truth reigns supreme, that they have a belief, even though they've been philosophized out of it, that somewhere truth exists that makes sense. And you can be the person that provides that common sense. Okay, and we are done. So very, very thankful that you've struggled through these various lessons. This will be the end of this session, so we bid you goodbye, and thanks for listening.